The sun had already begun to dip low behind the trees when Elijah Thompson stepped off the Greyhound bus. Dust swirled around his polished black shoes as he adjusted the brim of his worn fedora. The small leather suitcase in his hand felt heavier than usual, not because of what was inside, but because of what awaited him on the other side of town. Jackson wasn't his town. Not anymore. Not since he'd left Mississippi for Chicago 8 years prior during the war, chasing better wages and the thin hope of dignity. Yet, here he was, again, walking back onto southern soil for a reason he still wasn't sure he could explain, even to himself. As Elijah made his way down Farish Street, the part of town where colored folks were allowed to live and breathe, he caught glances from men sitting outside barbershops and women holding hands with children. Some nodded, some frowned. It wasn't every day a man dressed like Elijah, city suit, city shoes, walked through their streets. But Elijah wasn't here for a family visit. He wasn't here to see old friends or stand on the church steps shaking hands after Sunday service. He was here to walk straight into a storm, one that wore white robes and burning crosses. A letter and a promise. 2 weeks earlier, the letter had arrived, written in a trembling hand he recognized instantly. Elijah, it read, "They say they're holding a rally, the Klan, right here in Jackson next month. I don't know what to do. I don't know if anybody will stand up. I thought maybe you'd know what to do. You always did." It was signed simply Sarah. Sarah was the only reason Elijah had ever known love in Mississippi. Childhood sweethearts turned secret lovers, torn apart by skin and law. She was a colored woman like him, but life had taken them in different directions. Last he heard, she'd married a man named Joseph and settled into a life far from the dreams they once whispered under the night sky. Elijah had read that letter 100 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his coat pocket. He knew what it meant. Sarah was calling him home, or maybe calling him to something more dangerous. The town watches now as Elijah walked past a grocery store with "whites only" scrawled on the front window. He felt the weight of every eye on him. Jackson was a town that remembered. It remembered every colored man who stepped out of line. It remembered every whisper of resistance. He stopped briefly to light a cigarette, shielding the flame from the wind, and as he inhaled, he thought about his father. A quiet man, a preacher who'd once tried to speak out about a lynching in a neighboring county, and had paid the price for it. Elijah was only 12 when they found his father hanging from the sycamore tree by the church. The memory fueled his every step. At an unexpected ally. At the corner of the street, leaning against a lamppost, stood an older man, Reverend Paul Jenkins, a pastor of the local Baptist church. His once black suit was now faded to grey, and he held a Bible in one hand as though it were armor. "Elijah Thompson," Reverend Jenkins said, as though testing the name on his tongue. Elijah stopped, exhaling a stream of smoke. "Reverend, I heard you were coming," Jenkins said. His eyes, sharp under his weathered brow, looked Elijah up and down. "Folks say you've been up north, thinking you can forget where you come from." Elijah smiled slightly. "I didn't forget, just been biding my time." The Reverend nodded slowly, as though measuring the truth in those words. "They say you aim to go to that rally," Jenkins said. "I do." The Reverend glanced around to make sure no one was too close before leaning in. "Son, you walk into that field, they won't just look at you sideways. They'll string you up, same as they done to others." "I know." "Then why?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "Because somebody's got to. Somebody's got to show them they don't own fear." For a long moment, Jenkins said nothing. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden cross, worn smooth with years of handling. "My father carved this," he said quietly. "I carried it through the war, carried it through every funeral I had to preach for boys who never came back from the Klan's kind of war." He pressed it into Elijah's hand. "If you're gonna do this, take it. Maybe it'll remind you who walks with you." Elijah took the cross, feeling its warmth as if it held some remnant of the old Reverend's courage. "Thank you, Reverend. You be careful, son, and if you don't make it back, well, I'll make sure somebody remembers what you try to do." Into the night. That evening, Elijah sat alone in a room above the old boarding house Mrs. Hattie still ran for colored travelers. The small space smelled of kerosene and the sweet musk of magnolia drifting in from outside. He laid out what little he had brought: a pocket Bible, a photograph of his mother, a notebook with a few names, men and women he'd known who had suffered at white hands, and the letter from Sarah, folded and worn. He read it again before slipping it back into his coat pocket. Outside, the night was thick and humming with insects, but over that natural music, Elijah could hear something darker, rumors that had traveled fast across town. "They say they're coming from all over the county," he heard a voice whisper through the thin walls. "Sheriff won't do nothing. Probably right there with them," another answered. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. Tomorrow night, the Klan would gather in a field just outside Jackson. Bonfires would be lit, crosses would burn, and Elijah Thompson, a lone black man, would stand there, not as a victim, but as a witness. The air was thick with the smell of smoke smoke and something sharper, fear. As Elijah walked along the dirt road that led out of Jackson, the night sky glowed faintly orange in the distance. He could already see the flicker of fire rising over the trees. The clan was already gathering. His heart thudded against his ribs, but he kept walking, step after step. The small wooden cross Reverend Jenkins had given him lay heavy in his pocket, and his fingers brushed it from time to time, a silent prayer on his lips. The field of ghosts. When Elijah reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped. Before him, a wide field opened up, ringed by trucks and cars. Lanterns swung from makeshift poles, and a large wooden cross stood planted deep in the earth, ready to be set ablaze. White-robed figures moved like phantoms in the firelight, their hoods hiding faces but not intentions. There were at least 50 men, maybe more. Some carried rifles casually, as though they were nothing more than walking sticks. Others laughed and talked like they were at a church picnic. And there, on a raised platform near the cross, stood a man Elijah recognized from old town meetings, Sheriff Roy Cutter. No robe for him, but his badge gleamed in the firelight like a silent warning. Elijah's jaw tensed, so Jenkins had been right. The law was here, not to protect, but to watch and join. First steps into the lion's den. As he stepped forward, leaving the cover of trees behind, a sudden hush fell over the crowd. One by one, the white hoods turned toward him, as if some invisible signal had passed through them. Every step Elijah took felt like walking into a storm he couldn't see, but could feel, pressing heavy. By the time he reached the center of the clearing, just a few feet from the unlit cross, the whole group had turned to face him. Nobody spoke at first, just the crackle of fire and the low rumble of the men shifting, some adjusting their rifles, others clenching fists. Then a voice, sharp as a whip, cut through the night. Well, what do we got here? It was Cutter. The sheriff stepped down from the platform, walking slowly toward Elijah, his hand resting casually on his gun. Evening, Sheriff, Elijah said, his voice steady, though his throat was dry as bone. Cutter stopped a few feet away, looking him up and down. Boy, you lost? Or are you exactly as stupid as you look, walking up in here like this? I ain't lost, Elijah said. I came to see. The sheriff snorted. See what? To see what kind of men wear hoods to hide their faces. A murmur went through the crowd, low, angry. A couple of men took steps forward, but Cutter held up a hand. The exchange. You got some nerve, Cutter said. Maybe too much. You know who we are. I do, Elijah replied. I know what you've done to men like me, to boys like me, to women. I know all about the tree by the church, Sheriff. I remember. For a moment, something flickered in Cutter's eyes. Surprise, maybe, but it was gone as quick as it came. That was a long time ago, Cutter said. Not long enough. Cutter's jaw worked, chewing on his own anger. You got a death wish, boy. Elijah took a slow breath, glancing around at the sea of white hoods. Number, but I figure if a man's gotta die, better to die standing up than crawling. Another wave of murmurs swept the crowd. The men weren't used to being talked back to, especially not here, especially not by a black man standing alone. Lighting the cross, Cutter stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think you're gonna change something by standing here? You think anybody gonna remember you tomorrow? I think maybe they will, Elijah said quietly. Maybe they'll remember a man wasn't afraid of you. Cutter stared at him a moment longer, then sneered. Light it, he barked over his shoulder. Two men stepped forward with torches, setting them to the base of the cross. Flames licked up the wood, slow at first, then faster, rising high into the night. Sparks shot into the air and the heat pulsed outward. Elijah stood still as the cross burned, its orange light flickering in his dark eyes. The sheriff turned to the men gathered around. You see this fool? Let him be a lesson to the rest of them. A voice among the flames. Just as Cutter turned away, Elijah raised his voice, loud and clear over the crackle of fire. I remember my father, he said. I remember what you did to him. You think you can burn us all down, but you can't burn memory. You can't burn truth, and you can't burn out what's right. Some of the men shifted uncomfortably. Others growled under their breath. You want me to be afraid, Elijah continued, but I'm not, and I ain't the last. There'll be others, more and more. You can't stop all of us. Tension breaks. Enough, Cutter shouted, spinning back toward him. Before Elijah could react, Cutter backhanded him hard across the face. The blow knocked Elijah to one knee, but he didn't fall. Blood trickled from his lip, but he slowly stood back up, meeting Cutter's eyes. The men roared with laughter, some at least. Others stood quiet, watching, unsure now. You want to stand, Cutter said, his voice a dangerous whisper. Fine, stand. He turned to walk away, but paused, glancing back over his shoulder. If I ever see you again, you won't walk away. Elijah wiped the blood from his mouth, standing tall. We'll see about that. The long walk back. As he turned and walked back through the field, the fire at his back, the clan watched him go. Some shouted names, some spit at the ground, but none laid a hand on him. He walked all the way back to Jackson alone, under a sky filled with stars and smoke. His body ached, but his spirit burned hotter than any cross. As he neared the edge of town, he thought of Sarah, of Reverend Jenkins, of the faces of his people, tired, worn, but still standing. They would know. Word would spread. Tonight, Elijah had faced them, and he had not